Hello, everyone. Welcome to ICC's Game of the Week with your host, as always, Joel Benjamin. At some point, young players go from the hunters to the hunted. There was an interesting example of that in the National Open when teenage grandmaster Ray Robson went down to an unheralded player, William John Stewart. Stewart, a former Georgia State high school champion, played with great vigor and determination. And Robson, like many vastly higher rated players, may not have realized the danger until it was too late. Let's have a look at this remarkable upset. Okay, Stewart playing white, and it's going to be a Sicilian. Now, Robson plays a Sicilian defense, and he's been playing this for many years. He plays the Scheveningen system, and I've touched upon this quite a few times in Game of the Week, that this system has been kind of unpopular at higher levels, probably even club levels as well, for many years because of the Kerry's attack, G4. And we actually saw Paco Vallejo play a kind of a form of that from a Najdorf, where he entered A6 with H3 and then played G4. Robson, of course, every time he plays this opening, is prepared to meet this move, which is by far most popular among the stronger players. And he actually likes a line with E5, or at least he's played it many times, leading to great complications. For what it's worth, when I was a teenager, I also played this line for black. Of course, the difference was that was in the 70s. But we don't get the Kerry's attack in this game, as Stewart simply plays G3. And yes, it is possible to move this pawn just one square. The fianchetto in the Sicilian is actually quite a reasonable idea for white, because the bishop on G2 will exert some indirect pressure, might discourage black from fianchettoing his bishop. If the knight comes to C6, it could be some action on the diagonal. So it's just a solid place to put the bishop. And white still retains ideas of kingside attack later on. So we see knight c6, bishop g2. Now, very often black will play an early a6 and perhaps delay developing the knight. That is one way to do this. Black can play, for instance, a6, and maybe moves like bishop e7, castles, and queen c7, and delay the decision on what to do with the knight. But in this case, Robson just goes for knight c6, bishop g2, or bishop d7 rather, defending that knight on c6 in case white had some ideas of knight takes c6 followed by e5. White castles, bishop e7, and then rook e1. This is a common move in the Taimanov Sicilian. I'm not sure that it has so much purpose here, with black having already played the moves bishop d7 and bishop e7. It kind of has 2 points. One is to take on c6 and play e5, and the other is to dunk the knight into d5. But since black has played both these bishop moves, I'm not sure that rook e1 is really fitting in with these plans. And in some cases, you might prefer to have the rook on f1 behind the f-pawn for an attack there. But perhaps Stewart was slightly confused by the move order that Robson played, which is a little unusual. Now we see queen c7. Okay, so as I said, a6 is a very common move, almost ubiquitous move in the Sicilian, controlling the b5 square, making sure peace doesn't show up there. And of course, black may later want to advance b5 and start play on the queen side. Now, Robson decides to do without this move, and after queen c7, the game becomes very independently significant for not playing that move. Now, I'm not sure about all the ramifications of this, why Robson likes this move order, but I do know something about this position, having experience on both sides, that if black does play a6, one thing that white can do, a very simple kind of plan, is let's say a4 queen c7, or black can also just castle. We can have a trade here and a5 with this bishop coming to e3 and maybe to b6. And in this kind of position, white doesn't necessarily get an advantage, but it's usually a pretty easy position to play. And when you're a grandmaster playing somebody 400 points lower, in the opening, very often your biggest concern is just to get a position with play in it that will just create some difficulties for your opponent, so that he will have some challenges that he might not be able to meet. After queen c7, Stewart decides to try to take advantage of that with knight cb5. And when the queen moves, he sets up the Maroczy bind with c4 and e4. And it makes sense to do that, grab some space in the center. We see castles. Now h3, and this move maybe I can quibble with a little bit. I don't know that there was any great urgency to play this move and cover the g4 square. White could just retreat the knight from b5, or perhaps the move b3 was a little bit more to the point, because white is going to have to defend this pawn on c4 at some point anyway. So it's a good prophylactic move in case black, has ideas of whatever plan he plays. There will be a future tempo hitting that pawn on c4. Although it's interesting that Stewart actually does without the move b3 in this game entirely. Now after h3, Robson goes for knight a5, knight on the rim. But his idea is that he's attacking this pawn on c4, and if white just defends it with the most obvious move b3, black might well be able to get in a6 and b5. And b5 is a very key advance. Of course, d5 is as well. When white has the pawns in c4 and e4, black trying to get space. And in this case, white has a possible advance with e5, but it actually just plays into black's hands. It's just not good for white. So since e5 isn't on, it seems that black can get in b5 and would certainly be happy about that. That's why b3 might have been a good idea for white on the previous move. So to avoid all that, white plays the knight back to a3. Now that's not really an ideal place for the knight. Would rather be in the center. And perhaps Robson was a little bit too tempted by that, and maybe didn't play it as safe as he could have later on. He wanted to take advantage of that piece. So first of all, a6. And then white plays queen e2 to cover the b5 square to prevent black from getting in that advance. Now Robson plays queen c7, and this is played with the idea of keeping this knight stuck on a3. Now if white tries to defend the c4 pawn with b3, he can do that, but of course he has to watch out for his knight. If he then develops his knight develops a bishop on the original diagonal, we could see black getting in d5 with the knight hanging on a3. Still, I have a feeling that Robson probably was expecting something like that, but white goes for really a more aggressive way of playing. Stewart is not really trying to just hold on to maintain his position in the center. He's really trying to push it forward. I have to give credit for that. When black is playing, when a strong player is playing this kind of formation for black, very often his worry is that if white just kind of sits on it and doesn't allow anything obvious to do, that that it might be hard to go forward without maybe simplifying. So after bishop d2, rook a c8, rook a c1, and I think that black has maybe missed some opportunities in the last couple of moves with this knight now getting kind of stuck on a5. So I was thinking that instead of queen to c7, that maybe black should just retreat the knight to c6. Just a simple move. I think Robson wanted to keep the game more complicated. But in this kind of formation, very often that knight can be a liability on c6, and it's useful to trade it. And this is a little bit different from the hedgehog formation for black, where black would have a bishop on b7 and a knight on d7. And in that kind of position, black likes to have the knights on the board. But the knight on c6 is just not as flexible, and can often get in the way of black's pawn breaks. I suspect that he didn't want to play that, Robson, because white could then bring the knight back to the center and takes. Now in this case, if black goes for b5, then white could try e5, and this would be speculation on black's part. Probably this is playable, and of course we could have the position also with the c pawn and the a pawn already being exchanged. Black could speculate on something like this, but probably objectively it's better for white. There's also the idea to play e5, but in this case it's knight f5, so maybe somewhat funny looking move g6 as preparation to play e5 and then b5. I think this move e5 is a move that I don't know if Robson was looking for it enough, but probably it should have been played at some moment. It seems like it was might have been effective against white's setup. But instead we see black trying to pin that knight to a3, keep it stuck there. But now after rook a c1, the c4 pawn is very securely guarded, and we see that white is just going to take care of things there by playing the pawn to b4 and chasing the knight back after all. So when black plays rook fe8, and this is a very typical move in this type of position because you're putting the rook opposite the queen so that if d5 ever happens, the queen will be uncomfortable on a2. So on e2. So white does not want to open the e-file, but thing is that white's basic idea is to answer d5 with e5 whenever he can. So after rook fe8, Stewart goes forward with b4, chasing the knight, and then avoiding this exchange. So now actually white is accomplishing quite a bit here, and for his position to be perfect, he probably would want this knight on a3 in a different square, maybe let's say centralized to e3, and in that case black would have trouble moving things forward. But the knight on a3 is still a little bit out of play, and I think that black probably can take advantage of that somewhere around here. Now first, Robson plays queen b8, which is certainly a good idea to get off the file of the rook on c1, and that creates more possibilities of d5 and b5. And now Stewart pushes forward with f4, which is not so much about a pawn storm on the king side, probably more about pushing e5, actually threatening to trap the knight on f6. Now, alternatively, white could have tried returning the knight to the center, knight c2. Then there would be b5 available, but in this case, it could be met with c5. Now, that's a move that you generally don't have when the knight is on d7. Black's pieces here are not ideally placed. So that would lead to really a complicated kind of game. Now, after f4, Robson plays g6, and this is a typical hedgehoggy move. It gives a square on h5 for the knight to go to. The thing is that when white does play e5, it's going to chase the knight back awkwardly. It ends up going to e8, which is not really a great square. If it could go to d7, it would be happier, but that square is occupied now. So I think this is really the best chance for Robson to play e5. And note that one reason why this move is indicated is because we have a knight on a3 instead of c3. If the knight was on c3, it would be poised to jump into d5 and take advantage of that weakness. But since there is nothing ready to go to d5, there really isn't any white, well, there's no white piece looking at d5 right now, then e5 is not really weakening that square. But what it is it really is gaining a lot of important space in the center, killing white's idea of e4, e5 once and for all, restricting the bishops. And we see that black can still have ambitions in the center. If f5, it would be actually possible for black to play d5. This most tactical choice, for instance, if white takes on d5, knight takes b4. Here's one possible line. It's kind of interesting. If white plays d6 to try to win material outright, bishop d6, c5, attacking the bishop and the knight on b4. Black can play knight takes a2. So just grabbing lots of pawns, rook c2 and bishop a4. We see at the end of it, white manages to take advantage of those pieces, win 2 pieces for rook, but black is getting a whole bunch of pawns, can grab the pawn on d6, and I think that this is looking pretty good for black. So d5, certainly interesting possibility, but also in that position, black doesn't necessarily have to go in for that idea. There's also the b5 requiring less calculation, with the idea that if white takes his pawn on b5, black can counter by taking the pawn on b4 and attacking the knight. So actually knight takes b5 probably would be a mistake. But I think after b5, black is certainly doing fine. So the one way that Robson had to really take advantage of white's kind of unconventional looking strategy would be to get that move e5 in. But g6, maybe black is waiting a little bit too long to make a decision on that. Now comes g4. Again, not really about the pawn storm so much as threatening to win this knight. It was also possible to play e5 directly, and if the knight goes to h5, then kick it and just play from here. White can play as in the game with c5. But the text moved g4. Now let's have a look at this. Now black has to make room for the knight. Well, it's still possible to play e5, but it certainly doesn't look as good if white, let's say, plays f5, because the moves g6 and g4 seem to be definitely helping white, as g4 is part of this pawn storm with the pawn on f5, and there could be some weaknesses on the dark squares for black now. So if black is going to make room for this knight, he does it by playing rook e d8. The rook maybe will be okay on d8, but the knight has to go to e8, which is not great. Very often, when the knight is about to be kicked, if black has the opportunity to move the bishop and then create a square on d7, he might go for that, but there's no time for that. Bishop on d7 can't move until the rook does. So when black plays rook e d8, you see e5, knight e8, and c5. And I have to say that this kind of cramping strategies, e5 and c5 advance in such a position, I can't really recall seeing it before. It's a pretty original way for white to be playing this system, and you have to give all credit to William Stewart for that. Now black is getting pretty cramped in. The pieces just don't have a lot of space to move, so he's going to have to make something happen within the next couple of moves. Well, first of all, something has to be done here. If d takes e5, this at first looks like a good idea to chase the rook off the e5 pawn. Now, it's not clear that white can't just move the rook, because if black wants to take on e5, there also is a pawn on b7 that could be hanging. But rook f1 isn't even necessary. White can play knight c4. And indeed, this looks like a very promising exchange sacrifice, as black can hardly move and his dark squares are extremely weak now. So I think it definitely does make more sense to take on c5. Black can more easily break that down. So d takes c5, b takes c5. Now black could play here b5 right away. Robson plays b6. He actually maintains that option. To bishop e3. And now I think this is where Robson really gets himself into trouble, because he still can be okay at this point. He has to do one of two things, either to kind of keep it closed with b5, and then try to slowly unravel with something like knight c7. Black is going to remain a bit cramped here, but at least white doesn't have a knight about to jump into d6 or f6. The e4 is a key square. He can actually try to play the knight back from b3 to d2 and get there. But black has ideas. For instance, black has this maneuver knight c7 and d5 and start to get some activity as well. Probably more to Robson's taste would be to just take on c5. And after knight takes c5, black could kind of start unraveling a bit with knight b4, getting a little bit more room for the pieces. And also the knight is it can be secured with a5, so black doesn't really have to worry about attacks on it so much. So Robson definitely had to play one of those moves. But instead he played a5, just really a little bit too ambitious here, because white just has too much space, and black can't afford this loss of time. It's very much in Robson's nature to really go toe-to-toe with his opponent, but right now he had to play a little bit more conservatively. White plays rook b1, putting that rook opposite the queen, and now black is really, really squeezed after that move. We see g5, Robson breaking out on the king side, trying to break down that structure. Probably his king is not really endangered too much by opening it up there, as white doesn't have peace on the king side. But the biggest problem is that it doesn't really do that much. In fact, I don't really see any reason why white can't take on g5 if he wants to, because black can hardly take back on e5. Knight takes e5 is answered by bishop f4, and black is in trouble because of this pin. If queen takes e5, and that is running into knight c4, hitting the queen and the pawn on b6. So f takes g5 seems like it was certainly possible, but Stewart decided to play more directly with his plans with knight c4. And after g takes f4, he just retreated bishop f2. And this is really kind of a high-class approach to the position, because 2200 players usually don't think in terms of leaving the pawn, letting your opponent take a pawn, leaving it there. But because black is in such danger of being pushed off the board, that's really what's important now. The bishop stays on a more important diagonal. Black can hardly avoid taking. If black plays b5, white has a whole host of good places to go with the knight. Maybe knight d6 might be more important than taking any material, just sticking that knight in well, just bottles up all of black's pieces. So b takes c5, but now knight takes c5, hitting the queen. And this is really the kind of the hedgehog nightmare that black just has no pieces left for, no squares left for his pieces. They're all huddling on the back ranks, and now they become vulnerable. But Robson may still have felt he was okay here, because after queen c7, white can try rook to b7. But then black has a very nice shot here, knight to d4, counterattacking the queen. And after bishop takes d4, bishop takes c5. And black has really kind of done away with a lot of his problems. White can take on c4. And this black sacrifices the queen here. And now finally has active pieces, and matters are not at all clear here. So that may be what Robson was looking forward to, and felt that his opponent would probably go for this obvious move, rook b7. But Stewart was, thinking like a grandmaster here, and seeing the obvious move could have an obvious flaw, and he played simply knight takes d7. He's just creating all kinds of forking possibilities. Now here, Robson needed to simply take back with rook takes d7. And then after knight b6, he has a bit of a resource with bishop b4. Now this is one possible line, which may be somewhat forced for black. Bishop takes e1, queen takes e1, queen takes c8. The black pieces are in some trouble here. Bishop b6, but still black can fight out with knight to b4. And now if white plays bishop takes c7, there's the nice move knight d3, and this is really improving black's chances in the position. So better for white is to play rook takes c7, and after knight takes c7, pinning with queen c1. And this forces black to bring the knight back to a6 to defend, to avoid losing a piece. And now white can just take on a5. Probably will also pick up the one on f4 in a move or two, and can be up a pawn with the bishop pair against two knights, and knights certainly don't like to play against outside passed a pawns. So this would be a pretty cheerless position, but there certainly would be a possibility that white would go wrong even before getting here. Just in this variation, might play some other move. So maybe he just had to hold tight. But Robson looks for a tactical solution and comes up with knight to d4. But Stewart is not fazed by that move, and he just simply moves his queen. Queen e4, keeping in mind that he is already up a piece at the moment. Black will have to take back, and then we'll have all kinds of hanging pieces. Because the queen takes c4 runs into this fork with knight b6, and black actually is in danger of losing lots of material, because after the rook is captured on c8, it's also knight on d4 could very well be hanging. If black captures on rook takes d7, knight b6, again, threatening really more than just an exchange. There's every likelihood that black is going to lose even more material. So after the queen e4, black resigned, or perhaps lost on time. I don't have the details on that. But certainly Robson saw that he was going to lose a lot of material here. So a very surprising game. But it happens sometimes. Every grandmaster has a rough day against somebody that they would ordinarily beat almost every time. But sometimes an unknown player can be full of surprises, can come at you in ways you're not expecting, and you got to give full credit to William John Stewart for the way he went after Robson in this game, and actually ended up with a fine performance in the tournament. I should note that the event, the National Open, was won by Alex Lenderman, who started by winning his first 5 games and then drew in the last round. And I didn't actually see a game that Lenderman played that I liked as much as this one. Of course, this one had the benefit of being a real surprise result. But I do want to say to Lenderman, I know that Game of the Week has not been fair to him, and I think that I've only given his losses to this day. But some time along the way, I will get a win button by Alex Lenderman into the show, and I know that he's going to play just the right game at some point, and we'll even that out a little bit. Okay, well that does it. I'm Joel Benjamin, and as always, it's a pleasure to bring this show to you. And I want to thank you for joining me this time. I hope that you all enjoyed that game, and I hope that you'll join me again next time on ICC's Game of the Week.
Visit www.chess.fm.